All right, well, welcome. Welcome to the inaugural Daniel F. Cracchiolo Law Library Book Talk Series. I am Teresa Miguel Stearns, Associate Dean and Director of your Law Library. And this Book Talk Series will highlight books that our faculty, staff, and students publish during their time with us. I look forward to hosting these fun, educational, and interactive sessions in person come this fall. But in the meantime, I'm grateful that we can leverage technology and Zoom to allow us to come together today to celebrate and engage with Professor Sergio Puig on the occasion of the publication of his new book, At the Margins of Globalization, Indigenous Peoples and International Economic Law. What a perfect segue to sharing with you the University of Arizona's land acknowledgement. The University of Arizona sits on the original homelands of Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Aligning with the university's core value of a diverse and inclusive community, it is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up the Wildcat community. At the institutional level, it is important to be proactive in broadening awareness throughout campus to ensure our students feel represented and valued. Professor Sergio Puig joined the University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law in 2014. He is a professor of law and director of the International Trade and Business Law program. His academic interests include topics related to international economic law, international arbitration, law and society, network analysis, and law in the legal profession. Prior to joining Arizona Law, Professor Puig taught at Duke and Stanford Law Schools, where he was the Stanford Program in International Legal Studies teaching fellow. Professor Puig also worked for over 3 years in the Young Professionals Program for Lawyers and Scholars at the World Bank Group and ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. He has practiced law in leading law firms in Mexico City and Washington, D.C. Professor Puig also co-founded TradeLab.org, an online community-based platform to facilitate legal assistance and services related to international trade and investment matters. Professor Puig is in conversation today about his new book with Professor and Dean through June 30th of this year at the University of Colorado Law School, James Anaya. Dean Anaya served on the law faculty here at Arizona Law from 1999 to 2016 and at the University of Iowa from 1988 to 1999. Additionally, he has been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, the University of Toronto, and the University of Tulsa. Dean Anaya has taught and written extensively on international human rights and issues concerning Indigenous peoples. Among his numerous publications are his acclaimed book, Indigenous Peoples and International Law, and his widely used textbook, International Human Rights, Problems of Law, Policy, and Process. He served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2008 to 2014. Dean Anaya has also represented Indigenous groups from many parts of North and Central America in landmark cases before domestic and international tribunals. Among his noteworthy activities, he participated in the drafting of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Professors Puig and Anaya met here at the College of Law about 2 weeks ago to record their conversation about Professor Puig's new book. And we will have an opportunity now to eavesdrop on that conversation, which is about 20 minutes long. And then we'll come back together as we are right now for a live question and answer session with Professor Puig. I think the best way for Professor Puig to host the Q&A is to create a queue using the raised hand feature, which you will find under the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will also monitor the chat and pull out any questions for Professor Puig from there. We will end the formal portion of this book talk at 1 p.m., but Professor Puig is happy to stay on until about 1:15 to discuss the book and his work. So please join me in welcoming and congratulating Professor Puig on the publication of his new book. And if we were live and in person, oh, there's a lot of hand claps. Terrific. All right.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here with Professor Sergio Puig. who has just completed a book entitled At the Margins of Globalization, Indigenous Peoples and International Economic Law. Professor Puig, congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here in your house and at this beautiful place in Arizona. And thank you for inspiring the book, because you really did. You inspired this book, and I'm very grateful that you had a chance to come to this presentation.
Well, I'm really happy to be here in Tucson at the University of Arizona Law School. As you said, it's sort of my house. I spent many years here as a faculty member, so it's great being back and having this chance to talk to you about this wonderful project. As you mentioned, I've done work on Indigenous peoples, and I've really enjoyed the conversations that we've had. I've learned a lot from your insights, and I mean, you come from this topic as an expert on international economic law. That has really been your core subject. Is that fair to say? And then you branched out into this intersection, I should say, with Indigenous people's rights.
That's right. The core of the book is precisely that, right? Try to bridge the gap that I saw between these two strands of scholarship. One focus on the rights of Indigenous peoples that comes from business and human rights, and then the more traditional rights of Indigenous peoples scholarship that basically you've been part on developing. And the whole project, I think, had a little bit of a seed, right? When I had a chance of travel with you to different places where we were observing processes of consultation involving business interests.
Right.
Right. A process of consultation with Indigenous people.
Right. And I invited you to come along because of your expertise on business law in the international sphere. One of those projects that we looked at was in Costa Rica. It had to do with consultation regulation that was being developed in the context of business enterprises such as mining and other extractive and major projects. And then the other project was in Mexico, in the Juchitán Peninsula, had to do with a wind farm, and that was impacting Indigenous people. So tell me about how your interests in this book relates to those two situations that we were able to share in examining.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. In fact, one of those, it's a case study in the book, right? The case of the windmills in Juchitán. And in essence, what I perceive with this exercise of consultation is that there was a need to understand better how business law and indigenous rights have to share this space, right? This and what are the limits of the rights of investors, or what are the limits of the rights of traders when are in the presence of groups like Indigenous peoples. And I found that there was very little written, right? There was barely any mention in the literature, and I was very excited to try to take on this this project, in part because I felt there was an opportunity to make a contribution, right? To make a contribution in which you can actually say, well, these two different areas of law that sometimes seem too separate, right? The human rights of Indigenous peoples and the rights of investors are actually connected, and connected in deep ways, right? And I think that trip to Juchitán was the beginning of it, right? Our consultation in Mexico.
Right. So let's dig down a little bit on this. So the rights of investors, right? Those are in investment treaties, and that imply obligations that governments have for toward investors, right? And then on the other hand, you have Indigenous peoples who have rights that the government, at least in theory, is bound to respect. And so tell us about how these two areas intertwine in a case like Juchitán.
Yeah, that's absolutely, I think, a key question in today's understanding of both human rights law and investment law, right? I think how these two areas or different areas of law actually interact. I think in a case like this, I think governments should be aware that while they have some commitments, as you will said, that are expressed in bilateral or international economic agreements like bilateral investment treaties, that doesn't mean that they can ignore the protections and the duties that they have towards indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. So the main question is how to harmonize and adopt policies that, while they conform with their obligations, they also do not breach the investment treaties. And the main aspect that I would say here is that governments have a lot of policy space, right, to act in accordance with their treaty commitments under human rights law. So in other words, governments shouldn't use or shouldn't believe, right, that they are limited by the investment law treaties to avoid taking on or avoid complying with their commitments towards indigenous peoples. So that is my main message, perhaps, right? That they actually, governments shouldn't be scared to protect.
But isn't there, some would say there's a zero-sum game here, though, sometimes. Government, if it's going to respect the rights of indigenous peoples over a particular territory, that implies pulling back on what companies might say is are the government's obligations towards the company to allow it to operate, say, a mine or an oil field, or in the case of Huichitan, a wind farm?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the kind of tensions, or the tensions that we will observe, right? So governments may see this as a zero-sum, when in fact, I think most often is not the case. I think what groups that feel marginalized or not taken into consideration, like indigenous peoples in this case, they don't want to be a burden or anything like that. They want to be participate on these projects, and I think like that was something that became clear to me through this project, that governments, I think, can do much better by integrating in the decision making the indigenous authorities, right? That basically this is an area where well, this is an example where, you know, with a little bit of planning, right, the desires and aspirations of indigenous peoples can be accommodated in the decision-making process. And if that can be sorted out, I think we start moving away from this zero-sum game. Right.
Yeah, so often it seems that the companies themselves see a zero-sum. Either they're going to be able to get their project done, or if they have to respect indigenous rights, they're not going to be able to get their project done, right?
That's right, and I think that is that's a mistake of the companies, right? I think if they were better at engaging, you know, from the outset with authorities, and both at the local, federal, and municipal levels, right? I think they can avoid much of these tensions.
And what's underneath the resistance of companies? Sometimes you could say, well, it's just, you know, their economic calculus, but you know, we came across a fellow called Centeno, you know, and what does someone like Centeno tell us about what's underneath a lot of the attitudes that or the postures that companies take?
Well, I think it's ignorance at some level. I think also racism at another level, and the other one is, I think, is lack of understanding of some of these places, right? They don't. Some of the business leaders then don't really have not spent a lot of time in areas where they actually do business, or in areas where they have concessions, and I think that's detrimental to their own benefit. And
so they come up with a certain attitude towards indigenous peoples. They don't really necessarily see them as equals or capable of being real participants or partners in the project.
Right, and I think that is something that, or that type of attitude is across different sectors, right? I think like, many, I'm sure there's many businesses that do the right thing, right? I'm sure this is changing, but there's a level of arrogance where that I perceive in engaging in this work, that business knows better, and I think and that's part of the message as well, right? I think we will be wise to really try to learn from people who really have been in the process of taking care of some of the most pristine lands, right? For example,
the indigenous peoples, who are the ones who have lived there in these areas for centuries, and
for centuries,
have guarded it. So, what would you say the main audience, or who are the audiences for the book? Who are you trying to reach, and what are you trying to say to these different audiences? If you could just encapsulate in a few words.
So I guess there is maybe two different audiences. One is the audiences of indigenous rights advocates, right? Who I think have not paid sufficient attention to the new possibilities of using different tools from different areas of international law to advance the interest of indigenous peoples.
In this case, international economic law.
International economic law, right? So, and here there's some examples, right? Like the case of the Inuit exception that was successfully upheld at the World Trade Organization's appellate body, or some successes in different areas of international finance. And I think that it's something that we can, or indigenous advocates can rely more, right? Like engage with international economic organizations to advance the rights and interests of indigenous peoples. At the same time, I think I wanted to make much more aware the scholars in my field that a way of understanding globalization without indigenous peoples, it's a way of understanding just part of globalization. We actually we're not accustomed to see the negative effects. And one way that we can actually zoom into the negative effects of globalization is by seeing the most vulnerable of our members. And sadly, and I think this is also one of the messages of the book, that without really trying to understand the structural issues in our international economic frameworks, we won't be able to resolve the deep distrust that we have against international trade and economic law.
Right. So it's really a book that tries to bridges different points of views and reconcile them in a way, you could say.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's hard to provide many solutions to the big questions that the book raises. I think one of the main points that I'm trying to make here is we need to adapt our international economic agreements in a way that we put the people most affected by globalization first, right? Now, that to some extent can be a little bit naive, right? Because that ignores the deep structural issues that are at play. But at least I think by describing how they operate, I think people with better ideas will come participate.
And that's really the innovation of the book, isn't it? I mean, you have a vast literature and a lot of thinking and a lot of politics around the global economy and all these bilateral, multilateral investment treaties and a lot of activity around them. But the issues of indigenous peoples and human rights that you're addressing really are as the book says, they're at the margins, right? And so that you're trying to bring them in from the margins.
we are trying to recenter, right, the conversation in a way that brings the indigenous peoples into the to the center of this conversation. And I think we are at an interesting time, right? And you know, I think we're facing right now a pandemic. We're facing also this climate calamity coming, right? Are already affecting us. And I think it's time to find solutions that can actually be not only sustainable, right, but also that address the most vulnerable of us. And I think that's part of what I wanna that's how I wanna move the conversation.
Right. Yeah,
right?
and with these calamities, we many of us tend to just be so centered in our own world and what's around us, right? And it's easy to forget about the out of sight and the people who are not as well off. You and I were able to have this conversation because we've both been vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and so we're able to have a conversation without masks. But so many in other parts of the world aren't able to do that, including indigenous peoples throughout the world.
Absolutely, and I think the same has happened with the conversation around international trade, right? Like, you know, with the vaccine, right? This vaccine nationalism that you see, right? It's like we, you know, this is for us. We don't export anything, and you're right. I think like that is the reaction, right? That with people or governments are in these situations, right? That you know they face new challenges. The first reaction is like, well, we'll address them, and we have to take care of, you know, our populations. But I think that it's myopic, right? If we don't really address, you know, basically from a more inclusive perspective, what all these issues that are actually interconnected.
Yeah. And that's again is a theme of the book, right? These issues that are put to the margin, or people who are placed at the margins, really showing their centrality or putting them more towards the center and demonstrating the interconnectedness of the concerns that they have. So what's next? I mean, you are a scholar, you're a professor, you dedicate yourself to scholarship and writing. You're still relatively in the early stages of your career, I would say, from my standpoint at least, although you're quite accomplished. What's next?
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, we were chatting a little bit about this. I think that the challenges that Latin America faces in the next few decades are immense, right? And I think I want to participate in those conversations and try to bring to the attention of American legal scholars the importance of these issues. I think for many years, Latin America has been seen as this problematic region, at least from the perspective of the U.S. It's also, you know, if anything, a footnote in most of the scholarly about legal issues, right? I mean, I think maybe with the exception of indigenous rights, right? That you being a pioneer and a force. But I think in most of the literature in Latin America doesn't really, in the law, the legal literature doesn't appear very much in. It appears in the it appears in the margins.
Right.
So I think part of that is now kind of bringing attention of this type of.
So again, I see a theme here, looking at what's at the margins and trying to put it more in the center.
Yes, that's well put, right? So now do that with Latin American issues. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, congratulations again. The book is At the Margins of Globalization, Indigenous Peoples and International Economic Law. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Professor Puig, and I wish you great success with the book.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inspiring the book, and it's such an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Puig and Dean Anaya. And we've already got some questions in the queue. Professor Puig, I will silence myself and I'm going to just let you manage the queue at this point.
Well, thank you. And thank you everybody for being here. Really, it's an honor. And as you could see, I was a little bit overwhelmed by having James Anaya commenting or discussing the book. So sorry if I was a little bit nervous, but it's understandable. So why don't we start with maybe with Rebecca, who is also another force.
Hello, Sergio, and huge congratulations on the publication of that amazing book. I look forward to reading it. Your discussion was wonderful with Dean Anaya. I personally am very interested in the intersection of environment and then the controversy over development versus conservation. And obviously that's a planetary discussion, but it's also embedded in President Biden's 30 by 30 plan. So we're thinking about indigenous lands and territories in relationship to development and capacity. And so much of the action in climate change and kind of analysis is in Latin America. So I'm just really curious about your thoughts about that nexus. And then the status issues with indigenous peoples, like here, they do have forms of sovereignty that they can govern lands. I'm not sure how that's working in the various Latin American countries, but with respect to development, that struck me as important. And I didn't know the reference to the Inuit case that you and Dean Anaya were talking about, because I know that's another area of huge climate impact. And will be transformative in the next decade or two. So again, these are questions I have. I look forward to reading the book, but any initial thoughts would be so welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Rebecca. I think that is, one of the main tensions that I see. And to be honest, this is, my thinking of this has evolved, right, a lot. I think when I started the book project, or at least when we started doing the consultations, this is, I think, the first consultation that we attended was in 2015. My thinking was that basically indigenous advocates or indigenous communities and environmental interests were aligned. And it's often the case that they are not, right? For good reason, right? So in many ways, there is some reminiscence of an environmental movement, especially still prevalent in some parts of Latin America and other places, that is kind of very dismissive of the preferences and sovereign rights of indigenous peoples, right? Like, so, oh yeah, we want this land to stay pristine for our enjoyment, right? For our parks, for contributions, for our CO2, diminishment, right? Or whatever is the benefit that it can provide for other people outside. I think it was clear to me that the alignment of many indigenous communities wasn't there, right? Their beliefs, I mean, they really, what they wanted is to have more control over their resources and perhaps use them in ways that benefit the communities. With a little bit of skepticism, of course, of these traditional narratives of development. So I think you're right. I think that is the tension, and I think we'll see it as well with even with a progressive administration like that is coming, because it's going to take some time to address these questions. And I think you're right. I think at least in the US, with the way that the tribal sovereignty works, I think there's much more power on the communities. I think in Latin America, many of these issues are decided by very centralized authorities with very little knowledge of the realities in the local. Although this is also changing, and I think I was happily involved in the Constitutional Commission in Mexico, and I think this is one of the areas where authority has been transferred. And I think that can help navigate this, but this is going to take some time. So I think you're pointing into the key issue for the next 30, 40 years of, I think, indigenous rights advocacy. Right? Thank you. So maybe Christine.
Thank you, Sergio. I can't wait to read this book. Like Rebecca, big congratulations. This is really amazing. Today in my last human rights class, we actually talked about businesses and human rights. And for me, it's a fascinating subject. My sort of case study for the students was looking at private military and security companies. And that industry, I think, has been successful with developing industry codes of a code of conduct and sort of an association with a platform for monitoring compliance and sanctioning businesses and such. And I'm wondering, in your book and sort of in your research, if you have similarly come across any successful industry codes of conduct, or and also just your opinion on those types of mechanisms to regulate a particular industry, and how effective they might be in protecting human rights.
Oh, well, thank you. That's a very good point. And you're right. I think there is some aspects where military contracting has been ahead of the curve, right, in many aspects. And I think, or at least they have the leverage of the federal government and this large contracting to implement safeguards. I think the work of the World Bank has been also relatively good, although there is still a lot of things to do, right, that could be done. And the way that it works basically is the inclusion of safeguards that are part of these obligatory mechanisms that the World Bank has developed over time, that get included in the lending agreements with the governments. And I think that has had some success. And then you see more industry-specific codes, right? Like, there's, in the mining industry, there's starting to be much more codes that try to avert some of the main consequences of the mining industry. But I mean, it's relative in terms of what the size of the problem versus what they have accomplished. For supply chains, there's a model supply chains agreement that actually make the suppliers, right, much more responsible for their practices at the domestic level, and responsibility can go down, up, right. And then I also was part of this group that designed the business and human rights arbitration rules. Basically, are expected to be included in different instruments, and the idea is that can actually help adjudicate and assign responsibility to corporations that do not follow either these more contractual provisions or more public law in some instances as well. That will depend in many instances of how widely adopted these rules are at the end, right? But at least it seems like there's a lot of interest, and some companies in some sectors are now including them in their contracts. So we can talk more on the side, and I can give you some hints. But yeah, that's a terrific question. Thank you. Maybe Samara, I can see you here. Well, I can see your hand. I cannot see you.
Hi. So I know that everybody wants to hear from Samara, not me, but I'm actually the one who wants to ask the question. And I kind of want to ask two sort of related questions, so I can try to do that really quickly and then have you address both, maybe. But
before that, can I ask you to identify yourself?
Yeah, my name is Alan Dicker. I'm a second-year student.
Oh, nice. Thank
you. So I kind of wanted to go back to your conversation about whether this is sort of zero sum or not. And the first thing I wanted to ask is just about sort of how you see situations where the issue is not so much sort of a consultation process that an Indigenous community wants, but the ability to like withhold consent. And you know, how you feel that like kind of the right to withhold consent is something that may need to sort of have its own sort of legal framework, right? Or if that, you know, if that just is kind of rolled into a consultation process or not. Particularly thinking about situations where some of these projects and everything are already like in fairly advanced development stages where people, you know, companies have already gotten licenses and things like that, which sort of puts, I think, Indigenous communities a lot of times like on a very unequal playing field with these companies. And the second thing that I kind of just wanted to ask about is, you know, whether you sort of advocate in terms of these kind of international sort of economic agreements and frameworks in particular, and sort of laws of general applicability, whether you advocate for an Indigenous right to consultation in the creation of those international laws and frameworks, because I think that that's another way that sort of Indigenous communities go into the consultation process already on very unequal footing from these companies that have a lot of ability to influence those sort of general applicability laws.
Yeah, well, thank you for both questions that seem to be really well informed of the reality on the ground. And let me start with the second. Actually, the second question in some way was a little bit of the motivation of the book, right? Or was part of the motivation of the group. To what extent we should have a duty to consult international trade and investment agreements with Indigenous peoples, right? And I think that was a key question that I was thinking, in part because the special rapporteur was thinking about the past special rapporteur, Victoria, whose last name right now escapes me. Sorry for missing her last name, but she actually did a report on the effects of trade and investment agreements. So part of my question was, well, should we require the consultation on trade agreements? And then there was the position of the Inter-American Commission, actually, that said, you know, basically they do, right? They require some. And my point is, I think it depends, right? It depends I think there is ways in which the negative impacts of trade agreements can be lessened, and that may, you know, help sort out which ones have to be you know, consulted and which ones are not going to be consulted. But that's part where I discuss it. I have a small section of the book where I discuss this question. And I think it's a complicated one, right? But I think it's a motivating question of the book. I think the second one, the first one, which I'm addressing second now, I think I wrote an article with Professor Anaya on that topic. And I think I think the duty to consult exists, and it exists whether you include it or not in trade agreements. And I think, you know, governments have that duty to consult when their decisions substantially affect Indigenous peoples. I think the tribes, the Indigenous peoples, have the right to withhold consent, right? And I think it's completely the right and the decision. The question, I think, is what is the effect of withholding consent? And I think there's some debate here, right? And some advocates, and I don't think there are many people who advocate this. They say, well, that veto the project itself. The position that I took with Professor Anaya is different, right? That withholding consent doesn't veto a project. What basically is it creates a duty now of governments to ensure that there's no violations of human rights, because like the lack of consent or proceeding with a process proceeding with a project without the consent is not per se a violation of human rights. But if the consent is withholding, then the kind of the presumption changes, and governments can still ensure that there's no actual violations, right? People don't get displaced, the lands don't get contaminated, or then don't take it out, whatever a human rights violation you can imagine. And then governments can still offer reparations and compensations if violation exists. So I think like that's the way to think about the consultation process. Now, I barely touched that aspect, in part because that I think deserves its own treatment separately. And then I have an article which reflects mostly the thinking of Professor Anaya on that. But thank you for that question. Roy.
Roy, you're muted.
Okay, here I go. What theories of government or philosophies of government are most likely to lead to respect for indigenous rights? And is this a uniform matter, or does it vary? And you sometimes find more authoritarian governments actually protecting their local people.
Well, I mean, I don't think I know enough to answer that question. I think that is a big question. But let me tell you a little bit of the big idea that the book has, right? I think the big idea that the book has, in my view, is that basically the current model of globalization is also the result of political and economic ideas, but sustained in an idea of a Western culture of individual choice. Or maybe, it's just the illusion of individual choice, but with limited responsibility for people and especially for corporations. I think this culture, in turn, makes it very easy to ignore the way in which the systemic features of trade, investment, finance, and intellectual property agreements tend to marginalize different groups, which remain very vulnerable to the rapacious behavior by or that implicates commercial actors, very often with the involvement or tacit or implicit acceptance by governments. And I think while many of the legal mechanisms that underpin globalizations have also adapted thanks to these pressures, right, by indigenous advocates and by the pressures, I think, of democratic governments, including the US government, many indigenous peoples remain vulnerable and marginalized. And this is because they're failing to sufficiently accommodate the indigenous interest, or by accommodating them in a way that is an afterthought, right? Mostly by creating exceptions that allow governments to create programs that support indigenous peoples, but not really forcing the states, right, the governments, to take actions and in a more active way. And this has really been a misstep by governments and international organizations that have not really responding to the demands of change, to the own detriment, I have to say, of international economic agreements, right? Think what's going on the World Trade Organization and the pushback. And I think one way of thinking ahead, right, is what could these institutions do better? Well, I think they can learn from indigenous peoples, right? And learn to respect the distinct beliefs about and forms of economic organizations, right? Like how economic organizations happens in multiple different ways. They could have an active commitment with self-determination. And, again, right, more democratic governments have a more active commitment with self-determination, including communal self-determination. And I think this is the key aspect that I think will be the battle of the future, right? How to recognize individual and corporate duties towards our planet and future generations. And I think like this is the way that I try to think a little bit about this issue, right? That we need to rethink the way in which we include some of these ideas in trade agreements.
Thank you.
Professor Puig, I received a private chat question from a member of our audience. And so here's the question. How should multinational corporations and jurisdictions or countries that do not recognize Indigenous peoples and their rights enter into concessions on exploitation of natural resources in bilateral investment treaties?
Well, bilateral investment treaties don't work that way, right? What they do is basically create some protections for investors against expropriations, nationalizations, or unfair treatment by governments. And then they have these corporations a remedy, right? Which is a very controversial remedy, which is the right to sue a state, a government, right, before an arbitration panel. I think the mining or corporations that do not recognize that do not recognize a tribal authority maybe shouldn't be doing business. No, in that place, right? When there is, right? And I think it's often the case, right, that they conveniently ignore the existence of a tribal population or tribal authorities, in part because those concessions often, in many instances, are granted by the federal government, by a federal government, a centralized authority, without, any consultation or any engagement with the local populations. I think for corporations, this opens, or increasingly opens with the changing in legal frameworks, a lot of liabilities. And I think, if I were the lawyers, or if I was a lawyer for a corporation, I would say, don't do it, because this may create some liabilities for a corporation. And on top of this can result in human rights violations. I hope this answers your question, but I think it was a rather complex question in that sense. I'm happy to stay until 11:15, but I noticed that it's almost 1, and I want to give a special thank to someone who is or two people who are in the audience that I've been very supported by most of you, or if not all. But Benedict, who is now doctor-in-law, who just recently defended his dissertation, was almost a co-author of the book. He helped me doing some of the edits and doing some of the research. So I want to thank him. And also Andrew Shepard, that I also saw that he was here. I don't know if he remains here. He went to do one of his multiple tasks, who was also of tremendous help at the beginning of the research of this project. He basically helped me digesting the complicated world of intellectual property and indigenous rights. So I just wanted to say that before we finish, and thank them publicly for their help and support the project.
Thank you, Professor.
And I'm happy to stay for as long as thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for attending. This concludes the formal portion of our program. And as Professor Puig said, he'll stay on until 1:15 to answer any questions and to discuss his work. But many, many thanks to you, Professor Puig, and to Dean Anaya for coming together to discuss your new book. Many congratulations on its publications. On its publication, and thanks to everyone for attending today. And I'm really looking forward to doing more of these book talks with our community in the fall, when we're hopefully most of us are back together, maybe even in person, where we can gather in a classroom and share the amazing scholarship of our faculty, our staff, and our students as well. So thank you all so much.